It was little under 2 years ago. I worked from home back then and lived in a modest two-story townhouse. There were 2 bedrooms on the second story and a tiny kitchen and living area on the first. I had an office in one of those rooms. The apartment that shared a wall with me was unoccupied throughout this period. It had been more than 3 months since anyone had moved in or lived there. I worked quite late this evening. It was overcast and rainy outside. I opted to use the extra time to finish work-related tasks as I didn't have much else to do. I spent several hours using my laptop at the office. With the gentle sounds of the rain outside ticking against the roof, the home was silent as usual. I believe it was around 8 p.m. when I heard a thump on the wall next to me in between the soft clicks of my keyboard. I heard it again as I turned to look, a little perplexed. This was on the wall that was shared by It was a vacant flat, so of course it was a little strange. After giving it some thought, I concluded that it had to have been the owner checking in on something or perhaps getting the unit ready for an early morning tour. In any case, I kept working. I heard sporadic noises from the other apartments throughout the following hour or so, thumps, creaks, and other like noises. They were strangely dispersed. Like I would hear a single creak and then a few minutes would go by, prior to hearing anything more. However, at approximately 9:30 I heard a door creak open and then be shoved shut. I felt a little uncomfortable because this was louder than everything else I had heard all night. I didn't really know how loud or quiet the neighboring unit's door generally was because I hadn't heard it in months. After a minute, I made the decision to leave the office and take a break, going downstairs to double-check everything. Worked well with the other unit. I peered out the window beside the front door to see whether the owner's automobile might be outside, but I couldn't find anything. There is nothing parked on the road or in the driveway. Additionally, I didn't hear any noise from the other apartment when I was down there. I reasoned that whoever it was must have already departed, so maybe the odd sounds were over for the evening. I immediately went back upstairs to my office after making sure the door was secured. I wasn't sure how long I wanted to work. I was feeling fairly exhausted at this point and wanted to spend the remainder of the night relaxing in bed. However, I promised myself that I would give it another half hour. I shut the door to my office, took a seat at my desk, and completed as much work as I could. I didn't hear any more of those noises coming from the empty units during that 30 minutes. Outside, only the gentle rain continues to trickle. At last, I was pleased with the task I had completed and felt With heavy eyelids, I turned off my laptop and left the workplace. As I was getting ready for bed in my bedroom after turning out the lights in the corridor, a startling, menacing sound suddenly reverberated through the house's walls. There was a slow whistling sound, gentle melody. For a short while I stood there listening in silence. I suppose I was shocked by what I was hearing and how unexpected it was. I approached my bedroom door in silence and cracked it open. I could hear it considerably more clearly as soon as I did. It seemed too loud to be coming from outside or even from the next unit. As the whistling continued to fill the house's silent hallways, I began to move down the corridor feeling extremely uneasy. With the unsettling melody, I descended the stairs and headed toward the rear of the house where I could hear the music plainly. I looked into the living room around the corner, in the dark, without light. Meanwhile, a man was seated in the chair with his back to the black TV screen. He was staring into the completely dark room, barely moving, and he was still whistling. I could only make out his overall figure, but his hand on the armrest appeared to contain something, perhaps a tiny firearm. I knew he must have heard me slipping downstairs and knew I was inside. But he never turned around. Whistling, he simply looked forward. It was very unsettling. I was unaware of whether to speak up or attempt to flee. Why had he come here at all? How on earth did he enter? What was it that he desired? Before I abruptly decided to flee the house, my heart was racing. As I fled, I heard the man's whistling as I threw open the front door. The door to the other apartment was wide open, but I didn't see him follow when I glanced back just once. When I reached the end of the road, I made a help call. The same unsettling song was being whistled from inside when the police arrived. They cautiously made their way down to the living room, where they discovered the man in precisely the same spot. He reportedly cocked his head slightly to look-eyed them, grinning briefly and crookedly before dropping his revolver and allowing them to take him into custody. He essentially said nothing about why he was there, what he was doing, or what he had meant to accomplish. According to some of the cops I spoke with, he may have been attempting to be detained for whatever reason. Oddly, though, there is no information available on the man. No identification of any type or matching fingerprints. Additionally, they were unable to determine his true identity, or whether he had any sort of mental disorder that might be the cause of everything. I'm not sure what else might have happened that evening, but the mere thought of it unnerves me. However, occasionally, I can still hear the same unsettling melody being whistled in the middle of my sleep, causing me to awaken in a panic thinking he might return. I was 16. At the time, my parents and I lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. It was located an hour away from the main metropolitan region where both of my parents worked, in a smaller wooded neighborhood. It was a typical workday. Everyone was talking about this big storm that was due to arrive later tonight, and it was quite overcast and rainy all day. As long as I didn't have to walk home in it, I didn't really care. Fortunately, it didn't start raining until after school ended and I got home. Typically, these storms are overdone, but the clouds grew progressively darker while I watched TV in the living room with the windows open, and the rain eventually got much worse. To be honest, though, the wind was the most unsettling thing. The wind and rain pounded on the roof of our tiny, ancient, and essentially wooden home, causing it to groan and tremble. In any case, while I watched TV and waited for my parents to return home, I kinda just listened to the storm because I was certain everything was fine. However, my phone alarm abruptly alerted me to a flash flood warning at around 5:30. My mother called shortly after. She stated a number of they would have to wait it out because the roads leading home were reportedly flooded, and it was too risky for them to drive in. I replied it wasn't a huge concern because I was fine here, and the house appeared to be holding up. Knowing now that my folks were stranded in the city, I woke up and went to the kitchen. I thought I heard someone hammering on wood while I waited for my food to warm up in the microwave. It was difficult to tell because of how much the wind and rain had muted it, and I reasoned that if it was anything, it was probably simply the wind hitting something. The residence. I disregarded it as a result. After grabbing my lunch, I went back to the couch to watch TV, but I heard it again before I could even begin to eat. I was a little alarmed this time because it sounded like it was at the front door, which was essentially just next to me. Additionally, the banging pattern was precisely the same as the one I believed I had heard in the kitchen. This obviously led me to believe that it had to be a person, but that didn't make sense outside during this storm. For a moment, I was too terrified to even look out the door. I essentially basically waited for anything to happen while sitting motionless on the couch. However, when nothing changed, I eventually stood up and went to look out the door. I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Most of it was covered in fog. I could only make out the hazy forms of torrential rain. I spent some time looking outside to make sure I didn't see any persons moving or anything. But since there were no indications, I felt secure enough to open the door. I was initially relieved. There was no one present. It was simply the hideous storm outside. But suddenly I became aware of something strange. There were footsteps in the mud near the porch. The recurring pattern in the mud made it obvious that these were footsteps even though I couldn't see the shoe print or anything. Additionally, they had to be recent in order to avoid being washed away by the current weather. I suddenly shut the door after feeling a shiver go through my body. I was terrified and unsure of what to do. The sensible part of me wanted to call the police or my parents because this was quite odd for me to be alone and for the enormous storm to be occurring. On the other hand, I didn't want to concern people about something that presumably wasn't important. They must have already left because they weren't on the porch. That's how I thought anyway. I remained more vigilant, although avoided making any calls just yet. But I promised myself that I would call if I heard or saw anything else. Returning to the couch, I ate my meal while listening to the storm on the TV at a somewhat lower volume. Since I eventually just lay down, I honestly don't recall much else from that portion of the evening, and fainted while I waited for my parents to return home. I had no idea why I'd woken up, but when I opened my eyes, the storm was still as loud as it had been before, and the entire house was dark. However, I was aware that some time had gone by, and I wondered how I had managed to sleep for so long without my parents returning home and rousing me. As soon as I picked up my phone to check the time, I noticed that my parents had left me several missed calls and unanswered SMS. They simply wanted to know how I was doing and mentioned that they had to get a hotel in the city for the night because the roads were still too poor to drive in. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, I'm still attempting to wake up and not really processing any of the texts I've read. Then I heard what was arguably the scariest sound I could have heard at that very moment. Just above me, there was a single footstep on the wooden floor. The house doesn't creak because of the wind or something hitting it. There was definitely a footstep inside the home, in my bedroom, which was the room above me. As I listened for a few more seconds, my heart began to race. I walked carefully through my room, following the sound of the footfall as they stared at the ceiling. Next, they began moving in the direction of the upper hallway entrance. I realized I needed to move quickly. I put my phone on silent and sneaked into the main hallway's little basement bathroom, making sure to lock the door behind me and turn off the lights. They may not have heard me. I opened my phone, set the brightness to the lowest, and dialed 911. With the exception of the faint phone screen, it was completely dark inside. I muttered my name, address, and the situation when I noticed that the call timer had begun, indicating that an operator had responded, and then I returned to staying silent, yet continuing the conversation. When I started to hear footsteps coming down the stairs, I was terrified to even turn my phone down to the lowest volume so I could hear the operator. Between each step, the sound of rain and wind filled the corridor as the low thumps progressed slowly. They passed the restroom directly. Door. They continued till they reached the kitchen. After then, I waited for the following footstep for a few seconds. After that, a couple more seconds went by. Before I knew it, all I could do was wait for them to move or make any more noises, but I heard nothing. After a few excruciating minutes, there was a loud bang at the front door and police were called. I bolted from the bathroom and opened the door, but it was clear that the burglar had left because there were no more sounds coming from the house. The unnerving reminder of their absence was left by the sliding back door, which was cracked open. The strong storm probably kept me asleep, drowning out the sound of them breaking inside. But that might be the reason I'm still here today. The intruder appeared to merely enter my bedroom, proceed upstairs, and pass through the hallway. Thus my dozing out on the couch instead of, it was probably better for me to make myself known. However, it appears that they were searching for me, which is unsettling. Even now, years later, the fact that I never saw the individual is incredibly unsettling. Therefore, I have absolutely no knowledge about them. Regardless of whether they are a guy or a woman, an adult or an adolescent, someone I knew or someone I didn't, or even worse, someone who knew me but didn't know me. For the past few years, my parents and I have been on edge, hoping that whoever it was won't try to return to carry on what they had scheduled for that evening. In a suburban hamlet outside of a small city, I live alone in a pleasant, quiet neighborhood. I had been there for a number of years and didn't really have any problems. The majority of my neighbors were people I knew, and felt that our town was peaceful and serene. I was able to live my life in peace because hardly much ever happened. It was the middle of spring at the time. After a demanding 12-hour shift, I left work and drove home in the dark. Around 9 p.m., the neighborhood was still dark, and though roads were deserted because most people had been hiding inside due to the intense rain that had been falling for many days, I went inside and warmed up some leftovers in the oven before settling in for the night on the couch. But only 10 or so minutes after I arrived home, there was a loud banging on the front door. It truly turned me off, and I wasn't sure what it might be for or who it might be. However, I noticed a man standing on my porch when I woke up. He was soaked and was wearing a black rain jacket. I unlocked the door. "Are you in need of my assistance?" The man gazed at me for a while. He was extremely exhausted, as seen by his drooping eyes. He had a rigid, unmoving face. He had a black beard, longish brown hair, and appeared somewhat older than me, possibly in his early 30s. Rain-soaked hair. At last he spoke in a sluggish, emotionless voice, saying that his dog had jumped his fence and he wanted to know if I had witnessed it. "No, I haven't seen anything," I said. He gave me a sympathetic nod, but as he slowly turned away and left the porch, his gaze strayed beyond me and into my house. I shut the door. The man seemed a little strange to me, but perhaps he was merely quite worn out and irritated, especially because everything is taking place at night and in the rain. But I hoped he'd locate his puppy soon. Other than that, I returned to the couch and put it out of my mind. I would like to mention that I was watching TV for around 15 minutes when there was another unexpected knock on the front door. I knew right away that it was the same man, but I didn't know why he had returned. I woke up feeling a little perplexed and worried. Indeed, the same man was waiting behind the door when I glanced out. When I opened it, I asked him directly instead of being quite as cordial. What he desired. He still had that icy expression. The man stated he saw his dog run into my backyard and asked if he may go have a look. He pointed to the side of my house. The manor. However, he said that was quite odd. There was obviously a problem, though I'm not sure how to describe it. To remove him off my back. I added sure he could go back there and look around just in case he was telling the truth. He was, "Thank you," he said. However, he moved forward just as I was about to shut the door, almost as if he expected I would let him in and guide him to my back door. I simply kept shutting the door. However, he could have simply walked around the house into my backyard, so I'm not sure why he would have believed that. He went around to the side of my house as I watched to make sure he had departed. But, after all of that, I didn't feel very at ease with the guy just hanging out. I moved to the kitchen to keep an eye on the rear door. I cleaned up even though I didn't want to look at him through the door or anything. Some items on the counters while periodically glancing back at his activities. Every time I glanced, it appeared as though he was merely strolling around the yard's edge, till I once turned around and saw that his face was correct. Staring in at me from behind the glass, I was literally startled. I asked him what he wanted by shouting through the glass. He said, "Is his dog inside my house?" What on earth was wrong with this man? I told him no firmly, making it obvious that I was growing irritated with him. However, the man persisted in requesting permission to enter the residence so he could search for his dog. Every time I failed to answer, he would knock on the door. I could tell by the look on his face that he was becoming frighteningly upset that I wouldn't let him in. It was becoming somewhat terrifying. I contacted the police while he continued to beat on the door and curse at me. He didn't stop and leave until he saw me pull out my phone, which only increased suspicions about his true intentions. I gave the police a report about what had happened, his appearance, and other details, but that's where it ended up. At that moment, there wasn't much they could do. But regrettably, a week later on, an event that was very similar to mine occurred. Whether he broke in or not is unknown. The victims just permitted war inside, but the narrative was very identical to my own. When a man knocked on their house in search of his dog, things took a terrible turn. That night, the man stopped by my house performing the same thing, which disturbs me even more. Had I listened to him or shown any greater willingness to assist, I might have experienced a comparable destiny for the others.